Thank you again, Justin, and welcome back, everybody. Glad to have you back. I'm excited again about being here, and I just want to have one major shout out to Mr. Rick Covell right there on Zoom. Rick is a direct descendant of the Muma family of Sharpsburg, Maryland, where the Battle of Antietam was fought. And when you get home, you'll get in the email two letters from that were written after the battle, but were from a North Carolina artilleryman who fired on the Muma farm. The farm was destroyed during the Battle of Sharpsburg, the Battle of Antietam. And this was a fellow who participated in that artillery and burning the house and I think the barn as well. It's two really interesting letters, and they really go to the heart of what I wanted to talk about today, and that is the experiences of Marylanders in the war, whether they were soldiers and or civilians. This was part of the civilian experience. So, Rick, do you want to say anything? You could unmute yourself and say something and welcome.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Those letters, one of the letters that you were just referring to was from the soldier who was, along with 3 or 4 other men, burned the barn and the house down early in the morning in the battle. The letters, that letter, he wanted to send to the people that owned the Moomaw farm, but he didn't know if they were still there or what their name was or anything. So he thought the best person to look into it would be the postmaster. And the postmaster happened to be my great-great-great-grandfather's, one of his sons. And he was the postmaster and said, do you know anything about those people that own that house? And he wrote back and said, oh, yes, that was my house. Anyway, the soldier, well, you'll read the letter. He apologizes for what he did, but he had to. And my great-great-great-uncle, I guess it was, replied. But it's very interesting that those are 2 letters from people that didn't know each other as opposed to family members that were writing letters. So it's very unique, and they are in the museum there at Antietam. And and that's just one of the reasons I like history, and particularly the Civil War and exactly, Antietam. So
Rick, thank you so much for doing that and sharing it. And we had a great conversation last night. Neither of us could hang up, just talking about the whole situation, the battles and the war itself. We got to talk about the Talbot boys as well. But your input is greatly appreciated for the course. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for all that you do. It's very, very interesting, and I almost feel that it's necessary if you kind of like if you like the Civil War, to listen to what you have to say.
Well, thank you. I mean, part of what I feel is that, the Civil War is, long since over, but it's not dead by any means. It's still a living history. We kind of live it during our lifetimes, and especially when you live in a place like Eastern Maryland and in a state like Maryland, you're reminded constantly of it. And not everybody agrees, certainly, on what their version of it is, but we all live here, but the most important thing is we all need to continue to learn about it. And the more we know, the better and the clearer our perspectives will be, and the better our knowledge will be. So I'm happy to be able to participate. So welcome back. And what I wanted to do this time was talk about the war in Maryland. Basically there were areas of Maryland that were completely untouched by the war. There were areas of Maryland that were totally ravaged by the war on numerous occasions. And starting at the very beginning, you knew that Harper's Ferry across, was in Virginia across from Maryland Heights, which was Maryland. And the Potomac, is the border between the two states, and it's easily fordable in numerous places, the Potomac, north of Harper's Ferry. And that's where some of the battles took place, and the large campaigns came in to Maryland from that area. And the people were pretty much run over up there. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about it, because, it's interesting, the more I read, the more I realize how much I didn't know previously. And this time, preparing for this class, I really focused more on what actually happened to those people up there, including, the Muma family. That's just one family. And I remember that having read the book by Coddington on the Battle of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg campaign, that he had a lot of statistics on things that were taken, and removed, by the Confederates during that campaign. And I'm not pointing the finger at Confederates. Believe me, nobody suffered more than Virginians during the Civil War at their privations and things that were taken and things that happened to them and that were perpetrated upon them by Union soldiers. The same, believe me, having lived in Georgia for 10 years, I've heard the stories of Sherman's men, and many of them are true. But it also happened to the people here in this state. And I think that since we're here and we're talking about Maryland, I think we should go over some of that in some detail to appreciate what they went through, if nothing else. I didn't know about it. I'm not sure everybody else did either. So let's talk about it. We start with incursions right from the beginning of the war. Before Maryland was in a great position to have enough Union troops to defend the borders, there were incursions. And that I think that there were secessionists in Maryland who were still trying to force Maryland out of the Union, or at least promote as many Marylanders as possible to join the Confederate cause. And so right from there were incursions. There were groups of partisans, what were called partisan rangers. Do we know what partisan rangers were all about? They were basically troops who worked on their own. They weren't in the Army of Northern Virginia. They weren't in Jackson's Corps, or they weren't in any particular army unit. But they basically roamed about the Northern Virginia or the Shenandoah area, that whole area of Northern Virginia. The most famous of the partisan rangers was John Singleton Mosby. Well, pretty much heard of him. John Mosby Mosby, I'm not sure how he would pronounce his name, I think it was probably Mosby. But the point is that he was the most famous of the partisan rangers. And he was probably the only one who really had the true imprimatur from General Lee to go out and raid, do destruction, but come back with intelligence for him, so that he knew the status of what Union Army units were in that Northern Virginia area, in the area of Harper's Ferry, and in the important, crucial Cumberland Valley area where there was access to Maryland and Pennsylvania for any potential invasion that Lee would want to think about. And he was thinking about it throughout the early parts of the war, even through 1863 and 1864, and we'll talk about that today. But Edwards Ferry, I mean, you might have heard of some of these places, Edwards Ferry, White's Ferry, Boteler's Ford, and Williamsport. Those were right near Shepherdstown. If you've been to Shepherdstown, which is a really beautiful town, it's now West Virginia. It used to be Virginia before West Virginia left Virginia at the beginning of the war. Um, uh, those were the places where the Potomac was easily fordable. You know, up to here on a lot of people, that's me, up to here on here. Those, if I was 5'6", it would be up to here. But the point is, you could just walk across, horses could walk across, you could get wagons across, and you could move an army across it. And they did. But you could also move a partisan ranger group. And basically, they had a couple of main tasks that General Lee was always very happy to hear about. And that is just to get across the river and break up the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which brought supplies, you know, into Washington, D.C., ended up at the Georgetown area. And then the B&O Railroad. Anytime they could break up the B&O Railroad, that was a big plus for General Lee and all Confederate forces in the Eastern and Western theaters. And as the war went on, it became more important because the effectiveness of Herman Haupt, who was the military head of the U.S. railroad systems during the war and was pretty brilliant. He became more and more effective to where he could move whole corps. When the Union Army was sort of trapped in Chattanooga for months at a time, Grant made, and Henry Halleck, the general-in-chief at the time, were able to take 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac, put them on trains, and get them out to the Chattanooga area to break up that siege within a week or even less. That was, in 1860, that was revolutionary in terms of warfare. That was something that just had never happened before in the history of warfare. And here it was happening, and this, for the most part, as the war went on, the Union was able to station troops at crucial points, especially places like Harper's Ferry. I've made the point here, I realized that Harper's Ferry, the bridges at Harper's Ferry were burned down 5 times during the war. That's how important that was to the Confederate cause. And wherever they could break up, especially where there was a river crossing, it was crucially important for them to be able to destroy those and interrupt the flow of supplies. Remember, Baltimore, a lot of this stuff came down, it went up to Wheeling, Virginia, and beyond on the Ohio River. But also all the supplies, materiel, everything that was contracted for by the federal government had to come toward Washington, and it came much of it came via the B&O and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Far more, over the railroad because it was quicker. But that was really important. So on a regular basis, early on, basically the first 2 years of the war, Confederate raiders came across at Shepherdstown and across those waiting area crossings, and went as far as they reasonably could without running into Union regiments and cavalry units. And they did a whole lot of damage for quite some time. They were destructive. They did their job. And not only that, they brought back important, critical intelligence. It's something that sort of gets swept under the rug unless you really go looking for it. But that was an important, effective thing, and it was right there on the Virginia border and West Virginia border. But the Confederates absolutely took advantage of it, especially for the first 2 years.
What was the size of these groups? How big were they? How big were these?
They could be anything, a handful to a couple of hundred. If they were going to do a major foray to intercept the B&O miles up the track from Harper's Ferry, they would need a few hundred people, including wagons for dynamite if they were going to dynamite bridges and do things like that. So they were different size, but weren't always the same size. And sometimes if it was just getting intelligence, they just needed a few men. Plus, they also had a spy network, and they knew people in Shepherdstown and places like that, and they would get the word, that there's no discernible Union troops in the area. That's when they would make the raid. It really worked pretty well for quite some time, and it was pretty destructive. There weren't big battles. There weren't 2,000 people shot. None of that but it was effective intelligence and it was effective raiding into Maryland. But it also affected Marylanders, and even though it wasn't terribly destructive and they didn't have their houses burned, it was done, and it helped the Confederate war effort for those, at least for the first 2 years. So that was pretty significant. I was really interested to see how that worked. And interestingly, a couple of the Marylanders who fought and supported, for example, the secessionists at the Baltimore riots in April of 1861, men like Bradley Johnson, who became a Confederate colonel and then eventually was made a general. Harry Gilmore, a colonel, and they were from the north, and they were from Frederick, so they knew the area. They were from Frederick, Hagerstown, in that area, so they were natives of that area. And so they knew it, and they knew people, and they had contacts, and they took advantage of it. And so, interestingly, this was Marylanders leading and organizing these incursions into the state on behalf of the Confederacy. Later in the big campaigns, the Antietam campaign and the Gettysburg, they participated in those too, and they were really valuable there because they knew the territory. And Lee did not. Of course, in the Gettysburg campaign, it cost them dearly, but the point is that they had a lot of help from Marylanders in their cause. And so it's important for us to know that. Interestingly, one of the things that I did extra research on was the efforts by Confederates to seek out money from ransom, basically. If you don't give us X amount of dollars or supply us with X amount of sugar and bacon and everything, we're going to burn your town. Well, they didn't really do that in Maryland. What they were trying to do in the first couple of years was to get Maryland to secede. You couldn't really do that if you were burning the towns or doing too much in the way of seeking out retribution, money and loot. But later in the war, they did. And for example, when Jubal Early came to town, came up to the area in 1864, he demanded $200,000 from the town of Fredericksburg, Frederick, Maryland, for not burning the town. If people couldn't produce that, what they needed, they'll burn the town. They didn't do it here, but in that campaign, the town of Chambersburg was burned. A big part of that town of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, was just burned. I'm not even sure that they had the opportunity to meet a ransom demand. They just burned it. Because that was the town that abolitionist congressman lived and had his factory, and his factory was burned. It was I can't forget his name. But the point is that these incursions all had major impacts, on the people who live there. And so it's good to be aware of that and what our Marylanders had to live through. at the behest of some other Marylanders. So that was, I'm not sure how they all spoke to each other after the war was over, but they did. They got together, I suppose, and worked it out, because Harry Gilmore and Bradley Johnson are, well remembered and honored and hold honored places in the pantheon of Maryland's Civil War military history. So how that worked out, I don't know. But it happened that way. So let's talk about some invasions. I mean, this is about the Civil War in Maryland, and I think it's important. We talked about the politics and the industry and all that. Let's talk a little bit about the military stuff that was going on. Antietam, as we all remember, is the largest single bloodiest day in American history. I guess it still is. It was I think it's fair to say a major turning point in the war. You'll remember it was probably a tactical victory, but it's important to recognize that Lee started from the Manassas area. You'll recall, I think, well, I'm not sure I even talked about this, but after the first Battle of Manassas in July 1861, Beauregard and Joe Johnston were the two heads of what became the Army of Northern Virginia after Lee took it, but that was the army that was facing the Union once they drove them out of Manassas and back into Washington, D.C. But it was difficult for them at the end of only one railroad to continually supply a substantially sized army. And so there was a lesson. They basically moved back to the Rappahannock River, and they just gave away that territory. It made it easy for Union incursions to start marching, right down toward Richmond. And so in 1862, you'll remember that in June of 1862, General Lee took over the Army of Northern Virginia from Joe Johnston when he was wounded early in the 7 Days Battle. That's when McClellan was running his Peninsula campaign with the objective of taking Richmond, and they moved down the peninsula, got very close. Lee took over and just attacked and drove McClellan and the Union Army off of the peninsula completely and back onto the boats and back up to Washington. And following that, of course, in the process, he lost, not killed, but killed and wounded, injured about 20,000 men. Very important. Starts to add up. Because then he sent Jackson's corps back up toward northern Virginia again. And then he followed with Longstreet's corps. And they wound up having the second Battle of Manassas in late June 1862, almost beginning of July. That was basically almost a month. That big battle happened almost a month after the end of the Peninsula campaign. So here they are back up in Manassas again. They have this battle. They defeat the Union again. They drive the Union Army back into Washington in great disarray. They have an awful lot of confidence in themselves. General Lee this is his as high a moment of his confidence and the confidence of the Army of Northern Virginia as there was in the war, I think. But then what to do? What they realized was that with only about 45,000 men and a year down the road, the city of Washington was very much more strongly fortified than it had been in 1861. So it was almost impregnable for an army of 45,000 to try to attack, solid fortifications. So Lee was at it was a conundrum for him. He certainly didn't want to go back to the Rappahannock River to the Fredericksburg area and give up territory again. That was not his personality. So his decision was what to do. If you're not going to just retreat back to the Rappahannock, what do I do? And his thought was to make an incursion, make an invasion into the north. And he had several reasons for doing that. First was that this was going on into early September 1862. And what was coming up in November? The elections in the north. And he felt strategically that if he could invade the north successfully and stay there and be a presence in the north and threaten Washington or threaten Baltimore, that would influence greatly the elections in the north. And it would cause Lincoln to lose his political control of the House of Representatives, which he still had after his election. So that was one big reason. Another one was the European recognition. He felt that if he could do those same things and win a big battle in the north, that it would push European recognition, over the edge, and it would cause England and France to come in and at least recognize the Confederacy as a member of the family of nations on a permanent basis, and thus give them the legal opportunity to do shipping, commerce, maritime commerce, so that the South could start selling the cotton that they've been holding on to and embargoed at the very beginning of the war. The South was starving itself. The South was, already very quickly under huge pressure of inflation, because they didn't have much in the way of currency. They depended on bankers in Baltimore and in New York and Philadelphia, and that was effectively cut off once the firing on Fort Sumter began. So the fact is that there was a pressing need for European recognition so that the Confederacy could begin to start to balance its books and get some income, especially from all that cotton that's been stored and kept in warehouses throughout the South near the ports of New Orleans and Savannah and Charleston and North Carolina as well. So those were crucial, factors. And so Lee decided that even though things weren't really right, that he had enough skill and that his troops were good enough to make an incursion under some really not good circumstances that they weren't really prepared for. And I say that because of this. He had lost between the battle of two victories. He had won two victories, one in Richmond and one at Manassas, another at Manassas. He had lost probably almost 30,000 men, not killed, but wounded or otherwise hurt. And so, they could not really afford that very well. The other bigger thing in this particular thing was that a lot of the horses and their livestock were worn down from all this campaign. It was July now, and it was hot, and things were moving on into August, the dog days, and the livestock were worn down, and the men were having trouble supplying the men at the end of this one railroad that served Manassas. But he decided to do it anyway. And it became known to the Confederate soldiers as the Green Corn Campaign, because as they moved into Maryland, slowly but surely, they traveled around. They didn't go directly across from Manassas toward D.C. They went north and around up toward north of Harper's Ferry, and over up to Shepherdstown area. That's where they began crossing. That took more out of it. And apparently, so they had green corn, they weren't well fed, they were hungry, they were ill fed, they weren't logistically prepared to make a campaign with that many men. So as a result, of the 45,000 or so men that Lee started out with, between the food issues and a certain number of men, a good number of his men, didn't want to invade the North. They felt like they were defending the South. Men from different states like North Carolina. There are people with different levels of awareness and desire to be fighting in a war with the Union. So a lot of them didn't want to cross the Potomac and go fight in the North. And so between all of those factors and the horses being worn down, Lee actually didn't fight the Battle of Antietam with 45,000 men. He had closer to between 30 and 35,000 men. And that was a significant factor. So there were stragglers, and this is what the issue for civilians in Maryland. Whenever there are stragglers, and there were thousands of Confederate stragglers, for whatever reason, couldn't move it anymore, they become the problem for the residents in an area, because the residents get victimized because these are armed men who are hungry and thirsty, and they need to eat, and so they do depredations on the civilian population in an area, and that happened, during the Antietam campaign. But in the meantime, Lee finally crosses, and interestingly, in Lee's biography by Emory Thomas from the University of Georgia, he made the point where analyzing Lee's reports to Jefferson Davis is that Lee didn't really tell Jefferson Davis that he was invading Maryland specifically until after he was in Maryland. He didn't want to be put off by the government, by the Confederate government. So he didn't officially, they had talked about it, but nothing, they didn't have any particular plan. Lee, he said, Emory Thomas said, Lee must have thought he was Prince Metternich because he acted like he was the authority. And he was, he was the general in charge. But it was a crucial time. As a matter of fact, when Davis found out about it, he offered to come up to Antietam himself and lead the charge, and that was the last thing Lee wanted. But the point is that it was a move that Lee made, and early in the war they said that he was a man of audacity. His name was Audacity. And this was Lee being very audacious and probably somewhat over audacious. Also, one of the factors that made him do it was the fact that the Union Army of the Potomac leadership was very much in disarray at that point, after the low point of the Battle of Second Manassas. General Pope had been put in by Lincoln to try to replace McClellan, who was milquetoast toward the Confederates, and Pope was decisively beaten at Second Manassas. So what did Lincoln do? Once he realized that Lee was moving into the North, he put McClellan back in charge. And so McClellan gets back, and the Army of the Army of the Potomac is delighted that their favorite general is back in charge. But he proceeded at a glacial pace to move against Lee, even though Lee was in Maryland. And so as a result, it took Lee's own mistakes to kind of get him down. He was moving, his troops were spread out all over on this campaign. And basically they were foraging, but they were also scouting, the area to get good position in the valleys and the mountains. And so one of huge mistakes of the war was the Special Orders 191. Lee gave his whole battle plan to his key corps and division commanders. And we don't really know which division commander this particular order, copy of the order went to, but it was lost. And while they were meandering, in the area where the armies were fairly logistically close to each other, but not in contact yet, these three privates from the 27th Indiana found some paper. They found 3 cigars wrapped in paper and tied with a bow. And they looked at what it was, and they realized this was General Lee's specific battle plan orders. So they got it back to McClellan. And so McClellan had the entire plan of Lee right there. He could have immediately acted and attacked the Confederates while they were in widely separated geographical locations. And that would have been huge because Lee's army was depleted. The Army of the Potomac probably had 65, 70,000 men and could have overwhelmed the Confederates in detail. But McClellan waited a whole day and a half before he started really moving. And eventually, the way things got together, Lee had time to organize his forces and bring them together. And he was able to do that at the town of Sharpsburg, which is on Antietam Creek meanders through Sharpsburg. And there are several bridges that cross the creek there. And it's about 8 miles north of Harper's Ferry, and just a couple of miles away from the Potomac River, where there are crossings just a little to the north of that. So that was the strategic, and that was a godsend for Lee. It saved him, because when McClellan finally did get his people, the army together, he was able to attack, but he, of course, the mistake of many leaders in the Civil War was they attacked piecemeal. They didn't attack all at the same time. And so Lee was able, through the excellent support that he had from Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson, was able to keep moving different parts of their corps, different divisions and regiments of their corps to these key positions, including the Mumma's Farm. And the wheat field and Bloody Lane. And later in the day, Lee was still about to be overwhelmed as Burnside was crossing the Antietam with his Ninth Corps. There were just a handful of Confederates on this bluff on the other side of the river at the bridge, where they could just keep shooting the Union soldiers as they tried to come across, and it was a mess. But eventually they overwhelmed that small number of Confederates, and the Union had an open avenue to Lee's rear. It would have been a complete disaster. But at that very moment, one of Jackson's corps division commanders, Ambrose Powell Hill, Camp A.P. Hill in Virginia, that was A.P. Hill. He was in Harper's Ferry with Union prisoners that they had captured there the day before, 2 days before, and he arrived on the road from Harper's Ferry just in time to intercept Burnside's people as they were just finished crossing the bridge. So basically, it was A.P. Hill, the division commander, who saved Lee and saved him from being attacked in the flank, which would have been really decisive at Antietam. So basically, it was a standoff. They had the fight started early in the morning, and it lasted virtually all day. And that's why it was such a mess. And so in the process, the town of Sharpsburg was not obliterated, but there are several pictures of the main road in the town where many of the buildings were hit by artillery, It was used as a evacuation route by a lot of the Confederate units. And there was all kinds of, fights. So the town and the general area was fairly well decimated by the battle. But the interesting thing, of course, is that on the day after the battle, the 18th of September, McClellan failed to follow up and continue his attack. He just let Lee stay there for the day. And that gave a lot of people, historians and the impression that Lee had done everything he wanted to do and then was allowed easily, without much of any problem, to recross the Potomac, get back into Virginia, and save his army. And of course, Lincoln was infuriated. But the important thing to Lincoln was not that Lee escaped, but that Lincoln now had what he would consider, what he could call a victory, so that he could announce his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which would go into effect on January 1st, 1863. That is, freeing slaves who lived in states that were in rebellion against the Union. And eventually he did that, and that led the way to allowing for black soldiers, and it caused other problems down the road. But the point is that was, it was a major battle, and it was fought right in our state. Now, it's not a part of the state that we go to often unless we have family there, or unless we, just want to go to see the battlefields or love to vacation in the mountains up there, which is, beautiful. It's a great, that battle was of great significance, and it was fought right here in Maryland. And so, do you have any questions about it? Yes.
What was the desertion rate in the Confederate Army at that time?
It wasn't that bad. I believe, and thank you very much for being here. There was always desertion. I have a copy of General Lee's wartime papers, the wartime papers of Robert E. Lee. And he is always writing to Jefferson Davis about his issues with desertion. And at about this time, they were having real problems. Oh, very important. At that point in the war, the spring of 1862, that's when the initial effort had to be made by the Confederate Congress and President Davis to create conscription, the Conscription Act. And that was tremendously unpopular with troops. Why? Because if you were a slaveholder in the South and you had 20 or more slaves, which is usually the definition of what the planter class, you could resign from the army and go home and take care and watch out for your slaves, because they were fearful of slave revolutions, especially with so many men in the armies. And so that went over like a lead balloon with most of the non-slaveholders, who were poor men whose wives and children were home trying to make ends meet. And that was, and it started causing desertion. And Lee's correspondence indicates that the hills of North Carolina are starting to fill up with deserters who, just will not serve anymore. So what started, you can start to read between the lines of General Lee's correspondence, is that he was fearful that if he didn't use his army, he would lose it. And I believe, and I think that was his major inspiration for the next part of this talk, and that is the Gettysburg campaign. As you recall, that was July. The campaign started on June 10th. The Confederates started moving north from the Rappahannock line around June 10th. But it was only days before, well, it was a month before June 10th, May 3rd and 4th, the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was a major Confederate victory again. And even though they had, serious losses, Lee and Jackson had been talking about an invasion into Pennsylvania. And they just didn't, they weren't ready to do it. But of course, you remember, it was right after the Battle of Chancellorsville, the last, late in the day, in the early evening of May 3rd, 1863, that Jackson was shot by mistake, by a handful of North Carolina troops. And so he was gone, and he passed away. He was wounded and lived for several days and finally died of pneumonia, and after losing his arm. But that did not deter Lee for a minute. Only a week later, on the 14th or so, Lee was in Richmond meeting with Jefferson Davis and the cabinet, the Confederate cabinet, to get their approval for his plan to invade Pennsylvania and to create a decisive battle. Now, he didn't write down anywhere that he was trying to create the decisive battle to finish the war. But there was so much talk about that among his people, like Longstreet and other of his leading generals. There was a lot of talk about that sort of thing. So I find it surprising that, and I think it was a level of desperation that would cause him to do that without Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall still wasn't even cold in his grave at that point. But Lee was determined to make something happen. And I believe it was because he was concerned that if he didn't create this major battle, that he would just lose too many of his men. One of his quiet little strategies, tactics in managing the Army of Northern Virginia, and there's a book on it called Rebel Watchdog, was about his group of basic police, military police. There's a word for it, which I can't think of at the second. But basically, he had a very strong and very active rear guard, which kept people from deserting in any kind of large group. Over time, Lee had to stop allowing leave for his units from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. Why? Because they weren't coming back. They were staying there. It was, for whatever reason, men were, they had a long way to go to get home. They got home, and I guess they got a little comfortable, and they weren't willing to come back. And so he stopped allowing leave. I mean, it was a tough thing for those guys who were there with him, but that's what Lee had to do. And that all kind of fits in, I believe, to Lee's desperation. So what does he do? He makes the point where he gathers and gets the approval of the government to remove a lot of these units that were stationed along for defense of the coastal ports and everything, to get them to get up north and get into the army for this major campaign. He also wanted to and asked, but it didn't happen. He was trying to get Davis to order Beauregard and his group to cover Richmond while he was heading north into Pennsylvania. And so the fact is that this was the campaign, and he kind of knew it, and I think everybody in the upper echelon of Confederate military and governmental circles knew what was happening. So one other very important thing happened, and I think that it had a real bad effect on the performance of the Army of Northern Virginia in the Gettysburg campaign, and that is that after Stonewall was deceased, Lee broke up subdivided his army. When Stonewall was there, Lee had two corps, whether he had 40,000 men or 70,000 men in his army. He had two corps, One corps commander was Longstreet, the other was Stonewall. And Lee basically was working with two people. And those two handled whatever situation came up. They were really terrific. When Stonewall was gone, then Lee had some decisions to make. And there were really no other people that he could bring up and raise to corps command who were at the level certainly of Stonewall and his old warhorse, Longstreet. So what did he do? He promoted two people who he thought were the best available, both Virginians. And that was a point of potential criticism that Lee took. But the fact is that he promoted Ambrose Powell Hill, the guy who saved him at Antietam, and also Richard Ewell, who had been wounded in 1862 and lost a leg, but he was back in the saddle, so to speak. Even with that disability, he was a good, solid tactical general and had served well under Jackson, as did A.P. Hill. They both served under Stonewall in that corps. So now what Lee did was he sent his people up by corps. First corps to go was Ewell, and they made them a long march from the Rappahannock River out toward the west of the Shenandoah Valley, and then north up the Shenandoah into the Cumberland Valley of Maryland, and then into Pennsylvania. And the reason he sent them, and I didn't really think about this much before this class, was because they were foraging. They were foraging to feed the rest of the army when the army got there. And they had been planning to stay in Pennsylvania for an extended period of time. And as a result, yes, they were looking for a battle, a decisive battle, but they were looking to stay in the state and go through Maryland, not hurt Marylanders too much. They were very upset during the Antietam campaign because they had brought numerous muskets and uniforms to recruit Marylanders for the Army of Northern Virginia while they were across. That was one of their goals, and that was a flop. They only recruited about 200 men in all of that large area of the state of Maryland to join the Confederate Army during that campaign. And so while they were disappointed with that, they still held out some hope that they could get Maryland to join with the Confederates, or at least get many more Marylanders to join the Confederate armies. So they sent Ewell first, and he was foraging to some degree in Maryland. But once they crossed the line over to Pennsylvania, and they went through Gettysburg the week before the battle, and they went up to Chambersburg and several other good-sized Pennsylvania towns, taking everything that they wanted food-wise. The growth, the crops and everything. They never ate better. The Confederate Army never ate better than in the time that they were in Pennsylvania. They all say that. They did that. They pretty much just took what they wanted. Now, Lee made the point that we don't do depredations on civilians. We pay for everything that we take. And they did, in Confederate money, which at the time was pretty much like taking monopoly money for, what you want, somebody wants to buy from it. So they were taking what they wanted. They weren't, sometimes if they ran out of monopoly money, they would write a receipt of what they took, give it to the farmer and say, here, you can ask your government for them to pay you. And that's what they did. and very few of them ever were fully repaid by any stretch. But that was going on. So the second AP Hills Corps was followed Ewell, and then Longstreet's Corps was the third corps that made it up into Maryland and then finally into Pennsylvania late in June of 1863. Meanwhile, cavalry under Jeb Stuart was taking a circuitous route very close to Washington. And they were supposed to be covering and protecting both Ewell and AP Hill from attacks, surprise attacks by Union Corps and units that were between them and Washington. And before George Meade got the job as the head of the Army of the Potomac, Joe Hooker was still there. Hooker was having problems with the president and with other leaders, and so he was having a crisis of confidence. But he was managing to keep between Lee's now long outstretched army and looking for a place to attack it in the middle. That's what Lincoln was pressing him to do, but he didn't do very well with that because his cavalry, which was just starting to get into a point where they were considerably more competent than they were early in the war, they couldn't quite pierce the Confederate army in the Shenandoah Valley with the Blue Ridge in between them. But meanwhile, so they continue on. Jeb Stuart, meanwhile, gets lost close to Washington, D.C. You know, if you were ever on the Beltway, you see the Little River Turnpike exit. That's how close Jeb Stuart was. He was on that Little River Turnpike looking for a place to cross the Potomac as close to Washington as he could. But he kept getting intercepted by different substantially sized groups of Union troops. So basically, he had to ride close up, further upstream, and finally crossed, I believe, at one of the falls, above the falls. And so that's what he did. But he got basically lost, and basically Lee was relying on Stuart to give him intelligence about where the Union Army really was. And he failed to do that. And Jeb Stuart didn't show up for Lee until the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. So it was a battle that was fought by chance. It was not, Lee planned, had his own vision of how he wanted to fight this battle. That's not the way it happened, and that's basically blamed on Stuart, who, took a high-profile trip very close to Washington. He rode through Silver Spring, Maryland. That's how close, he was. So eventually he goes up into Pennsylvania and then goes way east and then has to, find his way west. So, and eventually he does that. But the point is that it was already late for Lee to be able to organize and fight this battle the way he wanted to, and he was shocked. I don't know if you've seen the movie Gettysburg. Have you all seen the movie Gettysburg? If you haven't, you really should see it because it is almost like a documentary. So much of the script, it literally comes out of the books, out of what these men said to each other. But one of the crucial aspects of the battle was an actor from Mississippi who Longstreet had hired to be a scout, to be a spy, and to go ahead of the Corps and to find out intelligence and keep bringing it back to Longstreet during the campaign before the battle. And so this spy was really good. And he found out and he identified the Corps, each of the Corps, and gave what their locations were on June 29th or June 30th, prior to the battle. And he was the one who alarmed Lee and informed him that the Union Army was not where Lee expected them
in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. The Union Army had kept moving. And not only was it moving, it was already in Pennsylvania. And a cavalry unit was already, at the town of Gettysburg. So that was a dire situation because Lee's army was spread all the way up to the Wrightsville, Pennsylvania crossing of the Susquehanna River. And then he needed to get these people back together because it was pretty clear and evident that a major battle was going to be happening very soon. So whereas the depredations on the Pennsylvania farmers was continuing, it ceased largely because the Army of Northern Virginia was desperately trying to get together and bring itself together as a group. And where could they do that? What would be the best place? And the maps all indicated that this little town of Gettysburg was the confluence of about 6 or 7 main roads that came together for that entire region of Adams County, Pennsylvania, which is only 12 miles across the border from Maryland, the Maryland-Pennsylvania line. It's only 12 miles south of Gettysburg. So the point is that Lee barely gets them together. The first elements of this meeting engagement happened when the first 1 or 2 corps of the Union Army arrived, and Lee also learned from the spy that the man who he expected to fight in this battle, who he had defeated decisively at Chancellorsville, was no longer the general in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Joe Hooker had been replaced by Lincoln with George Meade. And this was, Lee understood the difference between, because he knew all these guys when they were younger. And he was the commandant at West Point, and he knew a lot of them. He knew McClellan. But he knew the kind of person that George Meade he had been a corps commander for a good long time and was a very competent corps commander. That doesn't mean you're going to be a great Army commander. The fact that you're a great division commander like A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell doesn't mean that you're going to be a good corps commander either. And this is what combined to create havoc for Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. So as the armies are starting to gather together, and if you see the movie, they do a great job of relating the struggle in the heat of all the different various corps of the Army of the Potomac in struggling to get to the sound of the guns at Gettysburg. They could hear sometimes the artillery, but they still had to walk those miles. And if you go drive up through the towns of Taneytown and Littlestown, Fairfield, all through there, those towns were all marched through in the heat, desperate people falling out from, heat prostration, but in a desperate, effort to get to the battlefield at Gettysburg. That's where the two armies were meeting. So the first few corps arrived for the Union side, just as the A.P. Hill's corps is coming from the mountains across the Chambersburg Pike east toward Gettysburg. At the same time, Ewell's corps is the first elements of Ewell's corps are trying to get back to Gettysburg, but from the north and east. So they're coming from the north and east. The other corps is coming from the west toward the east, all converging at literally that moment at Gettysburg. And so there's where the initial clash is out on at Chambersburg Road and north of town. The Confederates push the Union. They're stronger. They got many more men quickly. So they push the Union back into town and through town to where they push the Union troops south of the town of Gettysburg up onto Cemetery Hill, which is a major promontory in that area. But they couldn't push them off of Cemetery Hill late in the afternoon. And so as a result, Lee is upset because he doesn't have a cavalry leader there to tell him where the rest of the Union Army is. He doesn't know how many men he's facing. He's not basically sure. Even his Third Corps is not even up yet. So this is it's not the way any general wants to fight a battle, but especially if you are in a situation like Robert E. Lee and you have got to win this and save, your army. Now, Lee, I think the worst thing that he did was he put the Army of Northern Virginia in the absolutely worst logistical possible position that he could have, so far away from his base of supplies. Lee did not know. One of the big advantages of fighting in Virginia was that Lee and his leaders, his officers, they knew Virginia like a glove. I mean, they knew that state. They knew all the back roads. They knew where everything was. They knew the mountains and valleys. In Pennsylvania, they really didn't know that. And that is what helped kill poor Jeb Stuart. He couldn't find his way back to the army. He didn't know which road was where. He didn't even know where General Ewell was. There was no communication. So he had to find his way around, and that was, devastating. Plus, if they were short on artillery and short on ammunition, where were they going to get it? They would have to attack the Union and get it and take it from them. But that's not a battle plan. That's just a reaction. That's just fortune, good fortune or bad. So he had put the Army in a really bad position logistically, and put them at every logistical and geographical disadvantage by being up in Pennsylvania to win this big battle. And so he and Longstreet had a disagreement. Longstreet wanted Lee not to start attacking frontally the positions that the Union had taken after the Day One battle, but he essentially decided that that's what he had to do. He needed a decisive victory, and he said it's either they're going to win this, they're going to beat us, or we're going to whip them. And that was his attitude, and that was very un-Lee-like. Lee's greatest skills as a tactician were to move to the flank and attack from the rear and do those kinds of things. At Gettysburg, he seemed to dismiss those kinds of things and ordered a Longstreet's Corps to attack, on day 2 up the Emmitsburg Road. And of course, what he didn't take into account was that the Union Corps commanders were moving around themselves to where one of them, the 6th Corps commander, moved his troops out to the Emmitsburg Road and attacking up the Emmitsburg Road in an echelon attack also quickly just then became a frontal assault. And it cost many more lives than Lee had ever thought about, but he insisted on making the attack anyway. So it upset Longstreet very much, and it created huge casualties on both sides. But the Union effectively was playing defense because the Confederates were attacking frontally. They were doing a great job. They were attacking with passion, but they were out in the open, and the Union units were basically shooting at them as they approached. That was a huge disadvantage. And so they wound up not being able to drive again on day 2, drive the Union troops off of Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Has everybody been to Gettysburg? Go if you haven't been there. I mean, it's, they had done such a fabulous job of preserving that battlefield. I give all the credit in the world to the Battlefield Commission, the battlefield preservation people. They have done a fabulous job there. But nonetheless, it happened that way. And on day three, Lee was completely, frustrated and decided not to listen to Longstreet's proposal to move around to the south and get between Washington and the Army of the Potomac, which made sense, but logistically, I don't know the nuances of that. It would have been difficult. But Lee decided to just take parts of Longstreet's Corps and AP Hill's Corps, and on that mile-wide front, use 15,000 men in a direct assault on Cemetery Ridge, while the cavalry was attacking from the rear, and Ewell's Corps would attack right toward Cemetery Hill again, which they had failed to do the night before. They had failed to take it the night before. Well, when you're in a position like he was, with a front that was the fishhook front that went all the way around the town and around the ridge and the hill, communication was very, very difficult. So they couldn't get a coordinated attack together. The attack following the bombardment on Cemetery Ridge went as planned, but the attack by the Confederate cavalry and Ewell's Corps on Cemetery Hill did not. And so again, that didn't happen in coordination the way Lee wanted it to. And so it was unsuccessful. And they, Pickett's division was slaughtered. It's probably as dramatic a place. I think it's haunted. I love to spend time there. I love every inch of the place I've been there, but I don't want to be there at night. I'm not hanging out on Emmitsburg Road at night, because I know where the groups of bodies were buried temporarily. And to me, that is, a special place that I don't feel like I'm welcome interrupting that. But it's tremendous hallowed ground, and I think it was that, along with what happened with the siege and the surrender of Vicksburg the very next day, July 4th, 1863. That was largely the overall death knell of the Confederate armies and military effort. But the fact that it happened in Pennsylvania. Now, what's important here is that there were major depredations of the civilian populations in that whole area of Pennsylvania. And as the Confederate troops were, in a way, shocked themselves that they managed, they were able to, they had never been defeated like this by the Army of Northern Virginia. So there was a level of shock and dismay by many troops there. And the fact is that battle gave the Army of the Army of the Potomac all kinds of quiet confidence, loud confidence sometimes, that they could beat these guys, that the Army of Northern Virginia and Lee were not invincible. And they were not. And this proved it to them. And it put that grave doubt in the Confederates' minds that they could lose those battles and wars. And eventually, they did. So that was a big thing. But the fact is that the people in the area were devastated. And the fact that I went back to my book on by Coddington, and he reported that after the battle, after the Confederates got back to Northern Virginia, they were able to secure 26,000 head of cattle and 22,000 head of sheep mostly from Pennsylvania, and drive them back across. They fed the Army of Northern Virginia for several months after that battle. So if you're looking at the battle as a roundup, as a meat livestock roundup, that was a big success. They were able to do that. Plus everything that they did. There were other, General Sedgwick reported that he himself and his corps had recovered 12,000 head of cattle and 8,000 sheep just across in Virginia as they were chasing the Confederates. So there was plenty, that's just an estimate of how much they brought out, but there was substantial. Who did they take it from? They took it from the civilians of Pennsylvania and to some degree, the civilians from Maryland who lived in that area. So those two battles, those were the two main, Antietam and Gettysburg were the two main invasions of the state of Maryland during the war. And whereas on the Eastern Shore, nothing like that ever happened. In the western part, it did happen. Yes.
When was Grant put in charge when was Grant put in charge of all the?
Of all the armies?
All the armies.
The question was, when was Grant put in charge of everything? After he raised the siege of Chattanooga in late 1863, by winter, early 1864, I believe is when Lincoln called him to Washington. And he was okay with Henry Halleck, who was doing that job. And Halleck had removed Grant from command after the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. So they weren't exactly buddies. So Lincoln made the move over and above Henry Halleck's objection, but he did bring him in. So essentially, when Grant got the job, he saw that what he had to do, and he understood as well as anybody the Confederates' issues with desertion and less and less manpower. Interestingly, there's a great book which you should all read called "The South versus the South," and the author is, don't make me think of the other thing, Freeling, William Freeling, Freehling. But he reports in his book and documents it, where in the Union Army during the war, 300,000 white soldiers from slave states fought for the Union side. 300,000 white slave state Southerners fought for the Union side. That includes Maryland, Kentucky, and the border states in West Virginia, but it also includes Tennesseans, 40 to 50,000 Tennesseans from eastern part of Tennessee, and many groups from Alabama, from the Appalachian areas of Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and that made a great big difference in the way things went, because those 300,000 men had that's a huge army. Think of what I stopped and think about, what could Lee have done with 300,000 more men? And I think that would have been a pretty decisive difference if Lee had those men instead of the Union side. But Grant, he saw that he needed and he had to organize the Union forces to be attacking all the time, to not give the South a chance to move units from place to place to place. And that's what he did. His strategy, Grant's strategy with himself and Sherman was once he put Sherman in charge in Chattanooga when he was called to Washington after that battle. And of course, the Confederates won the Battle of Chickamauga right after that. And so the Union was still essentially in the Chattanooga area at the beginning of 1864. When Grant started attacking with his overland campaign in 1864 toward Richmond, that's when Sherman started his move from Chattanooga toward Atlanta, down the railroad. And so that was I think the answer to your question. But there's one other invasion that happened, and this was not as big certainly, but it was potentially significant. And that was the Jubal Early raid July 1864. Also, and it eventuated with the Battle of Monocacy, near 6 miles from Frederick, on the Monocacy River, which empties into the Potomac, north of the ferry. But that was also crucial. Lee was already, had just recently been stuck in his siege, the beginning of the siege of Petersburg and Richmond. That started in June of 1864. And Lee felt a lot of pressure to get, to remove some of those troops, Union troops, from the pressure that they were putting on them. So he took Jubal Early, who had been promoted to a corps command, and he gave Early 18,000 troops and told them to enter into Maryland and move east and position yourself to where you could attack either Baltimore or Washington. And that's what he did. He moved quickly before the Union could react. And he got in, he crossed the river at White's Ferry, Shepherdstown. Once again, this is the third year in a row where here come the Confederates. And this was only 18,000, but that's a lot of mouths to feed, and they weren't bringing their own food. And the gloves were off with Maryland anymore, because it was clear that Maryland was not going to be joining the Confederacy. And so they did what they had to do. And Jubal Early was not a Robert E. Lee in terms of his attitude. He didn't care who he took from, and he was a hardcore person. And the depredations were pretty severe. And so he moved in and went as far as the Frederick area, and had his way. And as he moved to the Monocacy Junction, south of Frederick, which, of course, there were two bridges over the Monocacy in that area south of Frederick. One was the main national road, and the other one was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge. So first thing was to break that bridge up again, which he did. And then he decided on moving toward Washington, because he had intelligence that Washington was lightly guarded, because Grant needed so many troops to continually envelop the siege of Petersburg and Richmond. So Washington was vulnerable. And of course, when 18,000 troops appear, within 30 miles or so of Washington or Baltimore, there's panic. And in Baltimore, there was panic. And they immediately started enhancing a lot of the fortifications around the city. It was a frantic situation, because there weren't very many troops that could defend Baltimore or Washington. There were 6,000, but they pulled together about 6,800 troops to defend Baltimore. But Lincoln then told General Lew Wallace to go out and meet the Confederates and slow them down, while Grant was shipping a couple of corps up to the Washington area to make sure that Washington was defended. This was happening very, very quickly. And as a result, Lew Wallace, who became the author most famously of Ben-Hur long after the war was over, managed to get his 6,800 troops positioned fairly well, and they fought a delaying action against Early. So Early's 18,000 troops were delayed by a day, essentially. Wallace moved his troops back to defend Baltimore, because he understood intelligence-wise that Grant's Sixth Corps was moving up and was already beginning to arrive in Washington on the Potomac, and move up 16th Street, right up through the park, right up to where Military Road is today, and into Fort Stevens, which is still, I'm not sure if it's over the border in Montgomery County, but you've been to Fort Stevens, it's still there. Not all of it, but portions of it. And it's very dramatic. That's where Lincoln came to see Confederates, in person. And was standing up at 6'4" with his big hat on. And was told in no uncertain terms by this colonel, get the head down, you fool, you're going to get shot. But the colonel was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he told Lincoln off, but Lincoln got down, everything was okay. But the fact is that after Wallace left with his defenders for Baltimore, Early headed straight toward Washington, and from a promontory could see the dome of the Capitol that day. But by the time he got into position, enough Sixth Corps troops were available and in Fort Stevens to manage to put off the attack. As a matter of fact, the attack never really happened. I mean, there was skirmishing, but no major frontal assault on Fort Stevens. I think that Early understood he couldn't do that. One interesting thing, though, very interesting for us, was that Bradley Johnson and Harry Gilmore, the two Marylanders from Frederick, and Gilmore was from closer in, like Reisterstown or someplace like that. They had a mission. One of the side goals of this invasion was to free the Confederate prisoners at Point Lookout down in St. Mary's County, Maryland. And they had not a squad, and not a whole corps, but a regiment of men that were assigned to go and a cavalry raid to free the prisoners at Point Lookout. You know where that is? And then it's a great place in St. Mary's County. Nobody knows St. Mary's County. My daughter goes to the school there. It's a completely isolated place in the state of Maryland, but it's a beautiful spot. But at Point Lookout, they had started that prison right after the Battle of Gettysburg, because all of a sudden they had thousands of Confederates, some wounded, some hurt, but they didn't get very far. Once Early understood that the battle, that he could no longer proceed, he recalled those guys before they really got very far on the way south. And so that fairly well ended the incursion by Early in 1864. Yes.
I've been to Point Lookout, and I used to belong to a dive club, and they used to go down there, and they would take mini balls out of. But my question is it from the people that were going to go down, or was it from the south that they were bombarding?
Oh, no, they couldn't reach the shore.
It's pretty
the
wide
Confederates
there.
didn't have a navy or of any kind. But what they did have, and it was kind of a way out plan, it wasn't really logistically doable. But what they were going to do was come down with the cavalry, free them, and empty the prison, and then the Confederates were going to send ships across to pick up the prisoners and get them over to the Virginia side. I don't think that was very well thought out.
You know, where did those mini balls come from that were firing on Point Lookout?
Well, they might have been coming out from Point Lookout. They might have been, I really don't know. I don't even want to guess. I could have been target practice. I really don't know. I don't know. There was no battle that was fought there. There were no major prison breaks that way, and statistically, it was a place that started right after the Battle of Gettysburg. This was a year later. It held up to 20,000 prisoners at one time. In 22 months, they held a total of 52,000 Confederate prisoners, and 3,500 died. And some of them are buried there. There's a memorial a mile or so from the actual camp itself, and it's a nice tribute to the people who died there. I suppose, I don't know if has anybody been to Andersonville, Georgia? I have. It's one of the most solemn places I have ever been. That's a place, and this place, Point Lookout was open for 22 months. Andersonville Prison was open for about 8 months. And they had 33,000 prisoners there, 13,000 of whom are buried in the town of Andersonville, Georgia. And believe me, I could cut the air with a knife in that town. It is a very solemn place. And it's, man's inhumanity to man was evident in the Civil War from numerous of these prisons. But that was, I think, easily the worst. And one of the only people who was executed after the war was the commandant of Andersonville Prison, Henry Wirtz, in the same yard that the Lincoln conspirators were hanged. So that's just a fact. Now, summary. Much of the state was untouched by the war. Many people in different parts of the state that were not ravaged profited handsomely by union contracts, by contracts to feed the union armies, by shipping. Baltimore was a huge shipping center that sent out ships to supply union forts throughout the eastern coast and down to the Gulf Coast. So many Marylanders did very well with respect. Even secessionists, they could sell their food as well, and they did on the Eastern Shore here. There's and I didn't get it for this. I'll do it for the last class 6 of this theory. A report that the banks in Talbot County, Easton, had a substantially higher levels of deposits in the accounts of people who had accounts in 1865 than they did in 1861. And so many people made real money with union contracts out here during the war, whether they were secessionists or unionists. So in any event, slavery had been destroyed. The death knell for slavery came in 1862, as I think I mentioned day one, when the District of Columbia abolished slavery and slaves started moving off the plantations in the counties across from the Potomac and then further beyond that. And then, of course, in 1864, the state of Maryland officially abolished slavery. That was a very close vote. It needed the Union soldiers' votes in order to pass it, and it just passed it. But it did. And so that was pretty much the end of slavery in the state of Maryland. That's an important story for the population, for the civilian population. Of course, while it killed slavery, it didn't kill white supremacy or racism, which continued for another 100 years or so, maybe more. But in effect, that was the story of incursions and the battles and what happened to the people of Maryland during the 1861 to 1865. So I hope it's any further questions? Yes.
How do people communicate with each other about where to send troops and stuff?
They had telegraph. When lines weren't cut, they could communicate by telegraph.
Okay.
They knew pretty quickly, and there were main telegraph lines. It didn't, not like General Tillman had to ride from, Cornwallis' Sorrento to Philadelphia to Manassas. They could telegraph.
Okay. Thank you.
So, okay. Anything from you, Rick?
No, I'm very pleased. That was great. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody being here, and I hope you'll, sign up for the second half of this. I promise you, it's pretty good. So I'll look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mickey. Appreciate it, buddy.